Oops, wait. Welcome everybody. There we go. This seminar, this webinar is going to be data modeling with PowerPivot. This is me. That's me standing in Italy in front of the Ponte Vecchio Bridge, which is one of my favorite shots. My email address is kvic@pragmaticworks.com. I am a senior consultant with Pragmatic Works. I've been with Pragmatic Works about 2 years. Prior to that, I had 12 years with Microsoft supporting SQL Server. So I've been around the SQL Server environment. Actually, I've been supporting it since 1994 when it first came to Microsoft. Prior to that, I was doing Sybase, which, if you know the history of SQL Server, is the birthplace of Sybase, was where SQL Server came from. So since that was a perfect poll that we just did that talked about who this webinar, what you guys' experience is with PowerPivot, because I really want to focus on who I designed this webinar for. I have taught the PowerPivot class now at different companies as well as the public class probably 12 times in the last year. And one of the things that I notice when I teach the class is that people pick up the technology part of it pretty quick, but they really struggle with the data modeling aspect of it. So I decided I wanted to do a webinar that really focused on people who use PowerPivot, people who are pivot table builders, who have taken the class and still struggle with how to build that data model that is the basis for what we do in PowerPivot. This really is not aimed at that 2% of you who said you were experts, but I'm happy you're here, and you can feel free to question me as we go, and I'll try to take questions at the end. But that's really not who the webinar is aimed at. It's not aimed at IT people, unless maybe you're that developer who doesn't know how to data model. Then yes, this is aimed at you. The one thing I want to make clear is this is not a class on dimensional modeling. I actually do data modeling, and I've done it for a long time. Excuse me. But I'm not intending for this to be a formal class. Some of the things I will go through in this class are related to dimensional modeling, and that's where the basis of all this comes from. But I'm not going to be as technically strict as I would be in a dimensional modeling class. It's also not a PowerPivot class. I am making an assumption that you're a little bit familiar with PowerPivot. I'm not going to assume that you're an expert. My goal is to just help you better understand all of this terminology that we use so that you'll have more success with PowerPivot. I have sort of a secondary goal, and that's that those of you who are building PowerPivot models are probably working with your IT department in order to get your data, and I want you to have a better time talking with them, and I think your PowerPivot models will be a lot better if you have an opportunity to speak the same language that they're speaking. So let's talk about what's important about the data model in PowerPivot. If you've used PowerPivot, if you haven't used PowerPivot, PowerPivot is a tool that we use from Excel in order to build some user-level data structures. And the model is the blueprint of that data that we have to use. So building our data model in PowerPivot, what makes it so important is it really is the key to success in using PowerPivot successfully. It has a huge impact on performance. If you build your data model incorrect, your performance is going to be terrible. If you pick, for example, a single table and load all of your fields in a single table, the performance isn't going to be as good as if you load it in the correct format with multiple tables. One of the things I'll say about that I've learned is that teaching the data modeling section of PowerPivot is one of the least technical aspects. Once you're inside the tool, when we talk about modeling, it's not a huge technical challenge, but it is very business specific. It's probably the most difficult thing for a non-IT person to understand because it's mostly theory. A lot of this is theory. How we design these things, this is all stuff that we learn in data modeling theory. It's very hard for me to teach the modeling piece because it's a lot of theory and it's so specific to every business. Every company's data model is going to be different. And unless you happen to sell bicycles, which is what AdventureWorks is, the sample database for Microsoft, then when I teach the class and I use AdventureWorks, it's hard a lot of times for people to relate that to the business that they're in. So let's go through some terminology. That's the first place I want to start in this, is with terminology. I just want to talk about what everything means, because I will use these terms and I want to make sure everybody understands exactly what I'm talking about. The first term, of course, is PowerPivot. I almost didn't include this slide, but I just want to level set, make sure we all know what we're talking about. PowerPivot is the tool from Microsoft that's based in Excel that allows us to store a lot of data. It breaks the million-row limitation that Excel has. What it's really doing in the background, and this is the key to understanding PowerPivot, what it's really doing in the background is creating a structure that we call a cube that lets Excel automatically connect to that cube, and you build pivot tables off of that cube. So PowerPivot is really, you can think of it as an end-user cube that we build in order to build pivot tables. Many of you who have used Excel in the past have connected to larger cubes, multidimensional cubes that come from Microsoft Analysis Services or SSAS or some other technology. So you're familiar with connecting to them. What PowerPivot does is lets you build your own cube and then connect to it with your pivot tables. So what the heck is a cube? I just used terms and I want to make sure I define them. A cube is, if you've never heard this term before, it's basically a structure that came out of the three-dimensional modeling world. This is a term that's become kind of generic for data analysis structures. So in data, we talk about databases, and that's our generic term for how we store data that goes behind applications. A cube is kind of our generic term for how we store data for analysis. So I put a little picture on this slide of a cube, and just so that you kind of get an idea where the term came from. The term came from this idea, if you look on it, when we measure 3 points in space and we have 3 axes, then an X, Y, and a Z axis, what we end up with is a shape that kind of looks like a cube. I almost put a Rubik's Cube in here to demonstrate cube, but that was too obvious. I like this one because it sort of shows you we have 3 axes that we're measuring, and we pick a point out on those 3 axes. Each one of those axes is a dimension that we measure things by, the X dimension, the Y dimension, and the Z dimension. Now, in the real world, what you and I look at can only have 3 dimensions. We can map an X, a Y, and a Z dimension. But in math and in theoretical modeling, what we're doing here, we can have